I live in Florida, and I have for quite a long time now. I love animals, and I have a lot of rescue cats in my life. I appreciate any animals very much and would do anything to protect them. My neighbor has a German Shepherd, and it really is a beautiful dog. She was a nurse and often worked late, and even during the middle of the night. She'd leave her kids at her husband's house often and had the dog tied up outside. That was because she couldn't just come home and let her out when she needed to do her business. On the night in question, it was just past midnight. I was sitting out on the patio, just enjoying the night air. I don't tend to get a lot of good sleep often, so I'm often stuck awake late at night. It was such a hot and humid night out, so I went out wearing shorts and even still sweating in the heat. That was when something weird began to happen. The neighbor's dog was getting really worked up all of a sudden. I could see her and hear her, and she was acting very strange. She was growling and barking and trying to run around, stretching the leash as far as she could. This was quite unusual behavior for her, and it bothered me. This dog was usually very well behaved and calm, and would just kinda sit there. This gave me a bad feeling. Something in my gut told me I should go over and check to make sure everything was okay there. When I got over to the yard, I noticed that the leash had been tied around the patio tables and chairs. I figured she must have gotten tangled up and wrapped the leash around her on accident, and that was upsetting her. We all know a dog that's done that once or twice. That had to be the problem, right? I untangled the dog, fully expecting her to return to normal immediately, but that just didn't happen. The dog was now even more upset, growling, jumping, and barking. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what was bothering her. I thought I would just bring her over to my patio and try to keep her company until her owner came home. I knew my neighbor quite well, so I knew this would be okay with her. That night, there was supposed to be this meteor shower or something. I thought it would be nice to just have a little smoke and watch it with the dog laying next to me. I would remain awake and return the dog when the owner got home. I think it may have been about a half hour of us sitting there together when I heard the most horrifying, bizarre noise I'd ever heard. At first, I thought it was a motorcycle backfiring or something like that, but I lived in a subdivision, and the sound was a lot closer to me than the street had been. I wish I could tell you exactly what the noise was. Both before and after, I've never heard anything quite as terrifying. As I listened further, I realized it was some sort of animal growl. It was a nastier growl than anything I'd ever heard before. I took out my phone and shined the flashlight. My heart jumped in my chest when I found out just what had made that noise and why the dog was so upset. There was a 10-foot-long gator skulking about the yard, and it was very close to us. I don't know if you've ever been close to a gator that big, but I'm not Crocodile Kevney. I wanted no part in this. I grabbed the dog off my lap immediately. She must have known that gator was hiding there the whole time. I was scared to make any moves. Not the best response to a gator to try and run away. My fight or flight played rock, paper, scissors, and flight won in that moment though. I held the dog and sprinted to the sliding glass door. I got in and slammed it shut without daring to look back at that gator. As I locked everything up though, I took a little glance back just to see. That gator was right there on my porch in front of the door. It had tried to chase us as we ran for safety, and I only just barely made it. That night, the dog slept in my house. My cats weren't the happiest about it, of course, but there was no way I was going to let him outside with that gator out there. You hear all kinds of stories about scary humans, ghosts, demons, witches, and things like that on YouTube. But be that close to a gator, and trust me, it will scare the shit out of you much worse than any of those things. Once upon a time, I worked as a supervisor at a fast food restaurant. If you've ever done that before, you know there are all sorts of challenges that come with it. The one that annoyed me the most, though, was when we didn't have enough people to run the restaurant. A lot of times this was because of turnover, but not always. It also was because there were just times when you were not given enough people to work with. When I would close the store in the evening, I was given 3 employees to work in with me. This was one person to grill the meat, one person to make sandwiches, one person to make fries and hand out orders in the drive-thru, and me to take orders from the drive-thru as well, collect money from the customers at the window, and take orders in the dining room of the store too. Frankly, my boss was a big wuss, and he would always overstaff one of his other supervisors who was a lazy ass. Because of that, I ended up having to do a lot more work for a lot less money myself. This eventually led to me leaving the company altogether, even when they offered to move me up, give me a store of my choice to work in, and nearly doubled my salary. Just not worth the hassle. Of course, when you don't have enough people working in a restaurant, it's very easy to get some pissed off customers. There was this one particular night when just everything was going wrong. It was really driving me off the deep end. First off, our restaurant served baked potatoes. These take at least an hour to cook, and because of that, it was very possible to run out of them. You can never actually predict how many someone will buy at any given time, and late this evening, we just ran out because we had so many orders. There were these guys in a pickup truck who were really angry about this. I tried to apologize and explain the situation, but they just weren't having it. They began to insult me, and even when I offered something else in return, they turned it down and began to throw things at me. Then they drove away, only to come back and drive around the store over and over, enough to set off the drive-thru over and over again just to torment me. Finally, I threatened to call the police if they didn't stop doing this. When they didn't believe I would go through with it, I picked up the phone and dialed the police. Finally, they drove off. At that point, I walked up to the front counter because there was a family standing there as well. When I got there, the man sent his family out of the store and began to scream and yell at me because I wasn't at the front counter the very moment he'd reached it. He even told me himself he had been there for less than a minute, but he shouldn't have had to wait even 1 second to be greeted and served. Again, I apologized, but the man would hear nothing of it. He began to scream at me, "Do you know who I am?" over and over and over. Of course, I didn't know who he was, nor did I even care. Came to find out much later he wasn't anyone of significance anyway. I could be very patient with people, but when he began screaming obscenities at me and threatening me, I had enough and asked him to leave. He leaned over the counter with wide eyes and asked me, "Oh yeah? And who's going to make me leave the store?" I picked up the phone. I give free food to the local police department every single day, you know. If I call them right now, how quickly you want to guess they'll get here? Why don't you leave? The man did leave, still threatening me the entire way out. Then he violently drove his car out of the parking lot, as if he was making a point by doing so. From there on, I just tried to shove it all out of my mind, although I was so pissed off it was hard to focus. Thankfully, the rest of the night passed on much more peacefully. Eventually, 1 a.m. came along and we closed the place down. I let everyone else out of the store, while I finished up the paperwork for the night after the place was cleaned up. That normally would take about half an hour or so. As I was leaving the store, I set the alarm and locked the door. I began to make my way over to my car, but as I was doing this, I suddenly heard a voice right behind me. "How are you gonna call the police now?" the voice whispered in my ear. Turning around, I saw that man from earlier, the one I had thrown out for the threatening behavior. He had something in his hand as well. This was the late 90s. I didn't have a cellular phone, so I couldn't just whip it out and call the police. The man had this crazy look in his eye. I knew he was even more angry than he had been at the store. I was worried about what he was going to do. It looked like he had a wrench with him. I guessed he meant to bludgeon me with it or something. The only thing I could think to do was grab out my car keys. I quickly sprinted over to my car and opened the door, with the man chasing right after me. I hopped into the car with nary a moment to spare and slammed the door right as the guy slammed his wrench against the side of my car. It smacked against my car door, putting a huge dent in the side of it. The guy tried to smack my car even more. I started it as quickly as I could and slammed it in reverse. He tried to move behind me even, but I quickly let him know I had no problem running him over with my car if he continued his assault. I clipped his knee as I pulled out, and he stumbled over on himself. I shifted into drive and drove straight to the police station. That guy had made one really big mistake though. Remember how he kept asking me if I knew who he was? Well, because he'd done this so often, I remembered his full name because I was so upset by him being a little bitch. The police were easily able to find him and arrest him. The moron even kept the wrench he hit my car with, which was easily proven to have been the one that did it. Needless to say, I didn't work in the restaurant business much longer, and once I finally left, I never went back. I'm a female. When I was 16, I lived in the Valley area of Los Angeles, many years ago. As I explained in an earlier story, at this point in time, the best part of my week was Saturday nights, when I would meet my friends at our beloved under 21 nightclub to dance the night away. The vast majority of the time, I'd have to get a ride there and back. I didn't own my own car until a couple of years later, when I was already in college. Occasionally, a family friend would lend me his car, and on one of these Saturday nights, he did just that. I felt so independent and free to be able to take myself to the club and to be able to leave whenever I wanted as well. On the night of this particular story, I drove to the club and had a typically great time, dancing with my group of friends to music like Prince and Earth, Wind and Fire. At the end of the night, I got into my borrowed car and headed toward home. In case you didn't know this, the San Fernando Valley is made up of many suburban towns. None are very small, and some are very nice. As you'd expect though, some are less nice, with a higher crime rate. I lived with my family in a medium town in the northern part of the valley. Neither very nice nor very bad, with medium homes on mostly respectably, if not professionally, manicured lawns. Being the greater Los Angeles area, there were many differing routes I could take to get home. Freeways, highways, city streets. It was well after midnight at this time, but most routes I could take would still be bustling on a Saturday night. I'd had my fill of loud music, laughter, and chattering voices, so I opted to take a quieter route home. I took some busy streets, but then veered off into some quieter neighborhoods that would take me home eventually. If I drove through these quiet house-lined streets, I'd surely get home a little faster with no traffic. I was really tired anyway. GPS had not quite been invented at this time, nor even cell phones really. Instead, I had to rely on a written map, or just knowing the chosen route. I'd heard some bad things about a town called Pacoima, but I'd only really been through it during the day, and maybe once at that. Still though, I knew a route through there would shave a few minutes off my return time. Besides, being someone used to walking or taking buses, I felt blissfully and perfectly safe in a well-running car with plenty of gas in the tank. I was safer at this moment than at any other point in time. At least, that's what I believed. Still, I was a teenage girl alone after midnight in an area I was unfamiliar with. I was naive enough to think nothing bad could get me in a locked car. This is when I entered a residential street in Pacoima and only had to go a couple of blocks through to get to the next town, then to my own. As I drove down a dark, quiet avenue of modest homes, there were streetlights illuminating the unknown. This also helped with my feeling of invincibility. As I smiled to myself, enjoying the quiet night, I noticed a few people walking down the street towards me now. At first, I didn't give it too much notice. My left turn out of Pacoima was coming up just ahead anyway. But as they got closer, I realized it was not just a few people. It was a gang of 12 to 20, and they weren't casually walking down the sidewalk either. They were running down the middle of the street, right toward me. I had to suddenly slow down as to not run them over. This is when they all got a real good look at me. I could see they got instantly excited and animated as they realized I was a young girl all alone. Many exchanged smiling glances between them. Others were whooping and whistling as they started to surround me. Smoothly and effortlessly, as if they'd rehearsed this many times, several stopped me completely by standing in front of my car, putting their hands on the hood, as others walked around my driver and passenger doors and tried to pull at the handles to open them. I didn't always remember to lock the doors when I drove, and cars didn't have auto locks back then, but I was thanking God I'd had the foresight to remember on this night. Of course, this all happened very fast. In my shock and terror though, it felt like slow motion. I quickly adjusted my mind from carefree to possibly being abducted or worse by this large group of people. They had me completely trapped now. I couldn't drive forward, nor could I reverse. This time, the car was completely surrounded. As a couple of them picked up sticks or other objects to try and bust in my windows, I knew I had to do something right now. I did the only thing I could think of. I started to drive forward. Having blocked off my car completely, I could see the surprise on their faces. They knew they had to move out of my way or risk being run over. I immediately decided that if they didn't move now, I would be running them over. All the men standing in front of my car quickly jumped out of the way, and I sped up as I took the left turn out of there. I did make it home safely in the end, but my heart didn't stop beating out of my chest for the rest of the night. Of course, I thought about it for a long time after as well. I was proud of the way I'd handled the situation, but I also kept running through possibilities of what I could have done better next time. What if they hadn't gotten out of the way, and I'd had to run them over with my car? Would I have been able to live with myself? Should I just have sat in place and honked the horn to wake up people in the homes around me? What if the men had pointed a gun at me? I'm very happy it turned out the way it did, but it could have been so much worse. We all have to keep in mind that we're not quite invincible inside a car, no matter how cozy even heated leather seats may make us feel. Dark, quiet shortcuts are not a good idea, especially late at night. And always remember to keep your doors locked when you drive. This is a true story detailing something that happened to my wife and I 3 years ago. My wife and I lived in a renovated pool house on my uncle's property, up in a secluded posh neighborhood in the mountains of SoCal. The community was quiet, given the economic status of the residents, and the fact it was several miles up the mountain and far away from the urban neighborhoods. The community was also gated, keeping it even more secluded. That being the case, the only real traffic was people who lived there already, coming up to their McMansions. There were 2 ways up the mountain, one approach from the south and one from the west. Either way, you have to drive up several miles of narrow, windy, one-lane roads that both lead up to these razorback ridges in order to reach the community gates. For those who don't know, a razorback ridge is a narrow ridge with a steep 100-foot or more drop to the bottom. So this night, my wife and I are hanging out with a family who live down the mountain in the San Bernardino Valley. We're out until about midnight, when we decided it was about time to head home now. We started driving. As time goes on, the houses and street lamps get more sparse, and the darkness encroaches as we hit the base of the mountain. As we started to drive up, the street lights were now absent, as well as the lights of the houses. There was nothing but darkness and our 2 headlights illuminating the way. About halfway up, a thick fog started to develop, not too uncommon for the area. A little dangerous for us though, given how windy it was and how late at night it was too. Many people had driven off those windy roads on accident on nights like this and died in the valleys below, even if there wasn't fog out that had happened. I slowed down and stayed extra attentive to what was in front of us. The steep part of the ascent was soon over, and we reached the Razorback Ridge, just a few more miles till we arrived home. When we reached the top, the road leveled out. The fog now grew even thicker, limiting my visibility to 100 feet or so. Suddenly, I made out a large shape in the middle of the fog. It caught the reflection of my headlights, bouncing off a mirrored surface. I slowed down and came to see a new silver Mazda crossover in the road. The car was not merely parked in the shoulder though, or even in the traffic lane. It was parked diagonally right across the middle. The back half of the car was in the lane opposite to us, and the front half was in our lane. It was as if someone had come from the opposite direction, veered onto our side, and just stopped right there. This was particularly odd. That meant either someone came from our community several miles further down the way, or had driven all the way up the approach from the mountain bypassing our community, which was the only thing really up there. In either case, it made no sense for this car we'd never seen to be coming out this way this late at night, and to have stopped this expensive car right in the road as well. I could see the car was also empty. All lights were off, doors were completely shut, the car was not running, and nobody seemed to be nearby either. No flashlights shining, nobody calling for a lost dog, no flat tires, just the road, the fog, the silence, this empty car, and my headlights. As I slowed down and we approached the scene, I absorbed it in. The only thing I could think was, this is a trap. Every horror movie and survival video game I'd ever played told me that bandits or creepy creatures were gonna pop out real soon. That being the case, I retrieved my handgun and stopped the car, but didn't put it in park yet. My wife was also taken aback. "What the heck is this?" I said I wasn't sure, and I was going to call out to see if anyone needed help. Despite this creepiness, part of me thought there must be a rational explanation. Surely with a scene like this, someone must need some help. I cracked the window down a bit and listened in. No voices, no wind, just the soft hum of my own engine, which went into eco mode when stopped. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response. "Do you need some help maybe?" Nothing. I started to clench my pistol's grip tighter and moved my finger slightly closer from the slide to the trigger, anticipating anything. Still, there was nothing though. After having been there a minute in total, I said the dumbest thing in my life. I turned to my wife and said, "Hey, you think I should get out and check what's going on here?" My wife looked at me like the dumbass I was and said, "Let's go now." Even to this day, I still feel dumb for saying that. As soon as it left my lips, I realized I was sounding exactly like a generic horror movie extra about to get killed in the first 5 minutes. At that point, I realized it was time to go. I did my best to slowly drive around the car, trying not to fall off that damn cliff, scanning for movement in the fog and the vehicle. Nothing the entire time. We finished our drive home and talked a little bit, then went to bed. For the next week, I checked the Facebook community pages and local news for anything connected to this. Maybe a missing persons report, or a missing dog alert or something, even just anyone else who saw that car. But nothing came up. I drove that path again, and even dozen more times at that same hour, but I never saw that car again either. I still don't know what this was about. I can't rationalize it without copping out that it was just some elaborate prank or something. That seems impossible and ridiculous though. To be honest, it seemed like the road was intentionally blocked. But why would someone block the road intentionally with such an expensive car on this windy, dangerous mountain road in the middle of the night in a severe fog, and then not even come to check on their trap or whatever? It's a strange and creepy mystery to this day.